And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jeremy Pizzey.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here today in this hall where I've been on many occasions as a delegate to the Human Rights Council and sat over there and observed the proceedings that go on here. So thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And can I give a special thank you to the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. Your work gives an important platform to marginalised voices for social justice, to challenge policymakers and campaign for change. I welcome pressure both on my own party, the British Labour Party, and indeed on my own leadership to put social justice front and centre stage in everything that we do. So I thank you for inviting me to speak here in this historic setting, the Palais des Nations in Geneva. A city that has been a place of refuge and philosophy since the time of Rousseau, and a place of refuge for many people since then. The headquarters before the Second World War of the ill-fated League of Nations, which now houses the United Nations. It's a particular privilege to be speaking here because the constitution of my party, the Labour Party, includes a commitment to support the United Nations. And it's in our manifesto and in our rule book and in our constitution to secure peace, freedom, democracy, economic security and environmental protection for all. I also would like to thank my fellow panellists, Arantxa Gonzalez and Nikhil Seth, and Labour's Shadow Attorney General, Shami Chakrabarti, who's over here. She's here today as part of our delegation, and she's just published a remarkable book on the role of women in society, and she's dedicated her life to human rights and justice, and we're very proud to have her as our Shadow Attorney General in a future Labour government. She was a truly remarkable campaigner as head of Liberty, and she is an enormous asset to the international movement for human rights and justice. And can I also thank all of you for being here today? Was to give up a Friday lunchtime in Geneva to come and listen to a speech and take part in a debate shows your commitment to the cause and what we're trying to do here today. It's the run-up to International Human Rights Day, and it's a time to focus on the greatest threats to our common humanity, and why states need to throw their weight behind genuine international cooperation and human rights, both individual and collective, social and economic, as well as legal and constitutional, both at home and abroad, if we are to meet and overcome those threats. My own country, Britain, is at a crossroads. The decision by the British people to leave the European Union in last year's referendum means that there has to be a lot of hard thinking about our role in the world. There are some who want to use Brexit to turn Britain in on itself, rejecting the outside world, viewing everyone as a feared competitor. Others want to use Brexit to put rocket boosters under our current economic system's insecurities and inequalities, turning Britain into a deregulated corporate tax haven, low wages with limited rights, cut-price public services in a wholly destructive race to the bottom. My party stands for a completely different future when we leave the EU, drawing on the best of the internationalist traditions of the Labour movement and of our country. We want to see a close and cooperative relationship with our European neighbours outside the European Union, based on solidarity as well as mutual benefit and fair trade, along with a wider, proactive internationalism across the globe. We are very proud that Britain was an original signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights, and the 1998 Human Rights Act, passed in the British Parliament, enshrined the Convention and the role of the European Court and its case law into British law. So Labour will continue to work with other European parties and progressive parties and movements through the Council of Europe to ensure our country and others uphold our international obligations. Just as the work of the UN Human Rights Council helps to ensure countries like ours live up to commitments such as disability rights, where this year's report on Britain found us to be failing. I want to lead a government that works with the United Nations agencies on any findings they have about what's happening in our own country. International cooperation, solidarity, collective action are values that we are determined to project into our foreign policy. Those values will inform everything the next Labour government does on the world stage, using diplomacy to expand a progressive, rules-based international system which provides justice and security for all. They must be genuinely universal and apply to the strong as much as to the weak if they're to command global support and confidence. They cannot be used to discipline the weak while the strong do as they please, or they will be discredited as a tool of power, not of justice. That's why we must ensure that the powerful uphold and respect international rules and international law. If we don't, the ideals of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 will remain an aspiration rather than a reality, and international rules will be seen as a pick-and-mix menu for the global powers to call the international shots. Most urgently, we must work with other countries to advance the cause of human rights, to confront the four greatest and interconnected threats facing our common humanity. First, the growing concentration of unaccountable wealth and power in the hands of a tiny corporate elite, a system many call neoliberalism, which has sharply increased inequality, marginalisation and insecurity, and indeed anger across the world. Secondly, climate change, which is creating instability, fueling conflict across the world, and threatening all of our futures. Climate change knows no boundaries. Third, the unprecedented number of people fleeing conflict, persecution, human rights abuses, social breakdown, and climate disasters. And finally, the use of unilateral military action and intervention rather than diplomacy and negotiation to resolve disputes and to change governments. The dominant global system is quite frankly broken. It is producing a world where a wealthy few control 90% of global resources, of growing insecurity and grotesque levels of inequality within and between nations, where more than $100 billion a year are estimated to be lost to developing countries from corporate tax avoidance, where $1 trillion a year are sucked out of the global south through illicit financial flows. This is a global scandal. The most powerful international corporations must not be allowed to continue to dictate how and for whom the world is run. 30 years after structural adjustment programs first ravaged so much of the world, and a decade after the financial crash of 2008, the neoliberal orthodoxy that delivered them is breaking down. This moment, a crisis of confidence in a bankrupt economic and social order, presents us with a generational opportunity to build a new economic and social consensus which puts the interests of the majority first. But the crumbling of the global's elite system and their prerogative to call the shots unchallenged has led some politicians to stoke fear and division and deride international cooperation as if it is a form of national capitulation. President Trump's disgraceful Muslim ban, his anti-Mexican rhetoric, his incitement of misogyny, and that in turn has fueled further incitement, including racist incitement, has shifted the focus away from what his Wall Street-dominated administration is actually doing. In Britain, where wages have fallen for most people in the last decade, as the corporations and the richest have been handed billions in tax cuts, our government has followed a less extreme approach, but one that also aims to divert attention from the government's failures and real agenda. The Prime Minister threatened to scrap the Human Rights Act, which guarantees all of our people in our country civil and political rights. Human rights are universal. And our Prime Minister insisted, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. There is an alternative to this, what I believe to be bankrupt order. The world's largest corporations and banks cannot be left to write the rules and rig the system for themselves. The world's economy can and must deliver for the common good and the majority of its people. But that is going to demand real and fundamental structural change at an international level. The United Nations has a pivotal role to play in advancing a new consensus and a common ground based on solidarity, respect for human rights, international regulation and cooperation. That includes a platform for democratic leaders to speak truth about unaccountable power, as has happened in this very chamber and in New York. One such moment took place on the 4th of December 1972, when President Salvador Allende of Chile, elected as president of his country despite huge opposition, took to the rostrum at the General Assembly in New York. He called for global action against the threat from transnational corporations that do not answer to any state, any parliament, or any organisation representing the common interests. 9 months later, Salvador Allende was killed in General Augusto Pinochet's brutal coup, and that ushered in 17 years of dictatorship and turned Chile into a laboratory for free market fundamentalism. But 44 years on, all over the world, people are standing up and saying enough to the unchained power of multinational companies, to dodge taxes, grab land and resources on the cheap, and rip the heart out of workforces and communities. That's why I make commitments to you today that the next Labour government in Britain will actively support the efforts of the United Nations Human Rights Council to create a legally binding treaty to regulate transnational corporations under international human rights law. Genuine corporate accountability must apply to all of the activities of their subsidiaries and suppliers. Impunity for corporations that violate human rights or wreck our environment, as in the mineral-driven conflicts in the Congo, must be brought to an end. For too long, development has been driven by the unfounded dogma that unfettered market and unaccountable multinational companies are the key to solving global problems. So, the next Labour government will have a role for the Department of International Development with twin missions, not only of eradicating poverty, but also of reducing global inequality. To achieve this goal, we must act against the global scandal of tax dodging and trade misinvoicing, robbing developing countries and draining resources from our own public services. In Africa alone, an estimated $35 billion is lost each year to tax dodging, and $50 billion to illicit financial flows, vastly exceeding the $30 billion that enters the continent of Africa as aid. As the Paradise and Panama Papers have shown, the super rich and the powerful cannot be trusted to regulate themselves. Multinational companies must be required to undertake country-by-country reporting, while countries in the global south need support now to keep hold of the billions that are actually being stolen from their people. So, the next Labour government will seek to work with tax authorities in developing countries such as Zambia with NORAD, the Norwegian aid agency, to help them stop polluting. Tomorrow is International Anti-Corruption Day. Corruption isn't something that just happens over there. Our government has played a central role in enabling the corruption that undermines democracy and violates human rights. It's a global issue that requires a global response. When people are kept in poverty, while politicians funnel public funds into tax haven, that is corruption. A Labour government will act decisively on tax havens, introducing strict standards of transparencies for crown dependencies and overseas territories, including a public register of owners, directors, major shareholders and beneficial owners for all companies and trusts. Climate change is the second great threat to our common humanity. Our planet is in jeopardy. Global warming is absolutely undeniable. The number of natural disasters has quadrupled since 1970. Hurricanes, like the ones that recently hit the Caribbean, are bigger. They're absorbing more moisture from warmer seas. And it's climate change that's warming the seas, mainly caused by emissions from the world's richer countries. And yet, the least polluting countries, more often than not developing countries, are at the sharp end of the havoc that climate change unleashes, with environmental damage, fueling food insecurity and social dislocation, and giving reality to the concept of an environmental refugee as people are driven away from their homes and communities by the changes in climate. We must stand with them in solidarity. 2 months ago, I promised the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown, that I would use this platform today to make this message clear. His islands have been ravaged by the hurricane. The international community must mobilise resources, and the world's biggest polluters shoulder the biggest burden. So I ask the governments of the most polluting countries, including my own, first, expand their capacity to respond to disasters all around the world. Our armed forces, some of the best trained and most highly skilled in the world, should be allowed and able to use their experience to respond even more to humanitarian emergencies. Italy is among those leading the way, with its navy becoming more versatile and more of a multi-force role. Second, to factor the costs of environmental degradation into financial forecasting, as we have pledged to do with Britain's Office of Budget Responsibility. Third, to stand firm behind the historic Paris Climate Change Accords. And finally, to take serious and urgent steps on debt relief and cancellation. We need to act as an international community against the injustice of countries trying to recover from a climate crisis they did not create while still struggling to pay international debts. It's worth remembering the words of Thomas Sankara, President of Burkina Faso, the words that he delivered to the Organisation of African Unity in 1987, a few months before he was assassinated in a coup. He said this: "The debt cannot be repaid. First, because if we don't repay, lenders will not die. But if we repay, we are going to die." The growing climate crisis exacerbates the already unparalleled numbers of people escaping conflict and desperation. There are now more refugees and displaced people around the world than at any time since the Second World War. The UN itself calculates a figure of at least 66 million people that are refugees around the world, the equivalent of the entire population of my country. Refugees are people just like us in this room here today in Geneva. But unlike us, they've been forced by violence, persecution, and climate chaos to flee their homes. One of the biggest moral tests of our time is how we live up to the spirit and letter of the 1951 Refugee Convention, made here in Geneva, to support and recognise the crisis facing the many refugees across Europe at that time. It's a core principle, and it was a simple one, to protect refugees. Yet, 10 countries, which account for just 2.5% of the global economy, are hosting more than half of the world's refugees. It's time that the world's richer countries stepped up to show their common humanity as well. Failure means millions of Syrians internally displaced within their destroyed homeland, or refugees outside it. Rohingya refugees from Myanmar without guarantees of citizenship or protection from state violence. And refugees held in indefinite detention in camps that have been declared unfit for human habitation, such as those in Papua New Guinea or Nauru. Or African refugees sold into slavery in war-ravaged Libya. This reality should offend our sense of humanity and human solidarity. European countries can and must do more as the death rate of migrants and refugees crossing the Mediterranean continues to rise. And we need to take even more effective action against human traffickers. Let's be clear, the long-term answer is genuine international cooperation based on human rights, which confronts the root causes of conflict, persecution, and inequality. I spent most of my life making the case with many others for diplomacy and dialogue over war and conflict, often in the face of austerity. And I've listened to many speeches and taken part in many events in this very building here in Geneva. I remain convinced that it's the only way to deliver genuine and lasting real security for all. And after the disastrous invasions and occupations of recent years, there is again renewed pressure to opt for military force. Empire First, or Empire 2.0, is the path to global security. I know the people of Britain are neither insensitive to the sufferings of others, nor blind to the impact and blowback from our country's reckless foreign wars. Regime change wars, invasions, interventions and occupations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and Somalia have failed on their own terms, devastated the countries and regions, and made Britain and many other countries and the world actually a more dangerous place. And while my government, champions some human rights issues, on others it is silent, if not complicit, in their violation. Too many have turned a willfully blind eye to the flagrant and large-scale human rights abuses now taking place in Yemen, fuelled by arms sales to Saudi Arabia worth billions of pounds. The see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil approach undermines all of our credibility and ability to act over other human rights abuses. Total British government aid to Yemen last year was under £150 million, rather less than the profits made by companies selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. What does that say about priorities? And what does that say about the role we should be playing in the humanitarian disaster now gripping Yemen? Cholera is a wholly preventable disease, and it's rife in Yemen. Our credibility to speak out against ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims is severely undermined when our government has in the past been providing support for Myanmar's military. And our governments pay lip service to a comprehensive settlement and two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but do nothing to use the leverage they have to end the oppression and dispossession of the Palestinian people. Years after the UN General Assembly voted to create a Palestinian state alongside what would then become the State of Israel, and half a century since Israel occupied the whole of historic Palestine, they should perhaps take a lead from Israeli peace campaigns such as Gush Shalom and Peace Now, and demand an end to the multiple human rights abuses Palestinians face on a daily basis, to the continued occupation and illegal settlements. These are violations of international law and are a barrier to peace. The US President's announcement that his administration will recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital, including occupied Palestinian territory, is a threat to peace and has rightly been met with overwhelming international condemnation, including, I'm pleased to say, by the entirety of the European Union. The decision is not only reckless and provocative, it risks setting back the prospect of a political settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. President Trump's speech to the United Nations General Assembly in September signalled a wider threat to peace. His attack on multilateralism, human rights and international law should deeply trouble us all. This is no time to reject the Iran nuclear deal, a significant achievement agreed between Iran and a group of world powers designed to reduce tensions, and we should applaud the work, the patient work, done by so many to bring about that agreement, including President Obama in that room. That threatens not just the Middle East, but also the Korean Peninsula. What incentives are there for Pyongyang to believe disarmament will bring benefits when the US dumps a nuclear agreement with Tehran? Trump and Kim Jong-un threaten a terrifying nuclear confrontation with their absurd and bellicose insults of each other. In common with almost the whole of humanity, I simply say this to the two leaders: this is not a game. Step back from the brink now and talk to each other. It is a commonplace that war and violence do not solve the world's problems. Violence breeds violence. In 2016, nearly 3/4 of all deaths from terrorism were in 5 states: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria, and Somalia. So let's stand up for the victims of war and terrorism and make international justice a reality, and demand that the biggest arms exporters ensure all arms exports are consistent, not just with their legal, but with their moral obligations. That means no more arms export licenses when there is a clear risk they will be used to commit human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, or internal repression. Britain is one of the world's largest arms exporters, so we must live up to our international obligations and explore ways to convert arms production into other socially useful, high-skill, high-tech industrial products that the world is crying out for and actually needs. Which is why I really do welcome, the recent bipartisan United States House of Representatives resolution, which does two unprecedented things. First, it acknowledges the US role in the destruction of Yemen, including the mid-air refueling of the Saudi-led coalition planes, essential to their bombing campaign, and helping them in selecting targets. Second, it makes it plain that the US Congress has not authorized this military involvement. Yemen is a desperate humanitarian catastrophe. Starving and dying children from wholly preventable conditions and diseases deserve our support, our attention, and our aid. The weight of international community opinion needs to be brought to bear on those supporting the war in Yemen, including our own countries, to meet our legal and our moral obligations on arms sales and to negotiate an urgent ceasefire and settlement to this utterly devastating conflict. If we're serious about supporting peace, we must strengthen international cooperation and peacekeeping. My country, Britain, has an important role to play after failing to contribute significant troop numbers in recent years. We're determined to seize the opportunity to be a force for good in peacekeeping, diplomacy, and support for human rights. My party is committed to invest in our diplomatic and consular services, and we will reintroduce human rights advisors to all of our major embassies all around the world. Human rights and justice will be the heart, the absolute heart of our foreign policy, along with our very strong commitment to the United Nations and the role of international institutions. The UN provides a unique platform for international cooperation and action. And to be effective, we need member states to get behind the reform agenda set out by Secretary General Guterres. The world demands the UN Security Council responds, becomes more representative, and plays the role it was set up to achieve on peace and security. We can live in a more peaceful world. The desire to help create a better life for all burns within us. Governments, civil society, social movements, and international organisations can all help realise that goal. We need to redouble our efforts to create a global, rules-based system that applies to all and works for the many. No more bomb first and think and talk later. No more double standards in foreign policy. No more scapegoating of global institutions for the sake of scoring political points at home. Instead, solidarity, calm leadership, and cooperation. Together, we can build a new social and economic system with human rights and justice at its core, deliver climate justice and a better way to live together on this planet. Recognise the humanity of refugees, people seeking a place of safety, seeking to contribute their role in this world, and make sure we offer them that place of safety, and to work for peace, security, and understanding. The survival of our common humanity requires nothing less. We need to recognise and pay tribute to many all around the world who work in incredibly difficult circumstances for peace, for justice, and for human rights. and pay special tribute this weekend on Human Rights Day to human rights defenders all over the world, putting their lives on the line for others. Our voice must be their voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Corbyn, for that wide-ranging defence of human rights and multilateralism.